Hello and welcome to our first lecture on freedom of speech, assembly, and association. I wanted to say a few words before we get started. First of all, this is a very messy area of law, and the reason for this is twofold, I think. First, we're looking at cases across a long range of time, across eras, and people's attitudes toward expression change dramatically over time. And so we'll see that in the cases of the court, and in particular the court attempting to justify why it's permissible for government to punish certain kinds of speech, even when that type of speech has importance as for considering matters of public policy. The second reason it's messy, I think, is because it's context driven. In particular here, we're talking about public speech. For the most part, we're talking about people speaking in public or making public arguments. And we know that that kind of speech is very different than private speech because it has a greater tendency to lead to general unrest. So the first principle that the court articulates um, in one of its very first cases on speech, which we've already read, Schenck versus United States, is that the government has the power to punish speech that leads to disruption of social order and to public harm. Also, you should be very careful to keep in mind a couple of other concepts. The first one is that on average, I would say, and definitely in the modern context, the court holds government to a standard, and that standard is that it must be content neutral. Its laws, its regulations of speech must be content neutral, and government may not engage in viewpoint discrimination. So what do those two things mean? Content neutrality means that when government opens up a forum for public speech, either allowing people to march in the street or to speak at a public rally or whatever, in whatever context, when government opens up a forum, it cannot, except under certain circumstances, limit the kind of speech that people engage in. In other words, the subjects, the content of the speech. It can't prevent the public from discussing certain matters because government doesn't want that discussion. Viewpoint neutrality refers to the types of views expressed about content. So once government has allowed people to speak on a particular topic, it can't then choose sides in the debate on that topic and say, prevent those who are in favor of affirmative action from speaking for it while allowing people who oppose affirmative action to speak without being punished or excluded from a forum. So those are two important concepts: content neutrality and viewpoint neutrality. Okay, so let's get started. So we're talking about the First Amendment, of course, and does no law, the statement no law in the First Amendment, really mean no law? Well, we know the answer to that. No, it doesn't mean no law. We know that from our discussion of free exercise and religious establishment. There are any number of instances in which government may suppress speech, but you should keep in mind that government may only suppress speech when it's remained content neutral, does not engage in viewpoint discrimination, and also is able to articulate precisely what threat to public order exists from the expression of the speech. As it says here, only two justices have taken a truly literal interpretation of the First Amendment, Justices Black and Douglas. All other justices seem to have understood that free speech has to be evaluated within the context in which it occurs. So we'll start talking about these legal standards in just a moment, but here are two questions for you. First, do we really want the court to be the arbiter of these important decisions during times of crisis? Would the court decide differently if we weren't in a time of crisis? So why am I asking these two questions? Well, we're going to see that most of the free speech cases that we will be discussing occur within the context of very public crisis for the nation. We're talking about wartime, opposition to the war effort, economic crises. The first cases come out of World War I. There are cases that come out of Vietnam era protests and Gulf War era protests. So during those times, I mean, think back to Korematsu. During those times of crisis, the court generally defers to the political branches, and in particular the executive acting through the military. And is that those are usually the times when speech deserves the most protection, and it's the time when the court possibly is not as capable of fulfilling its role of standing between us and government to protect the individual. So you're familiar with our first case already, Schenck versus United States, but the context is that Congress passes two laws, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Espionage Act of 1917, Sedition Act of 1918. Look very closely in the text for the description of these two acts and how they affect speech. But generally, they were an effort to prevent people from speaking publicly in a way that would undermine the government's war effort, and it also makes it illegal for groups to organize specifically for the purpose of advocating lawlessness. So Schenck, as we know, targeted his audience specifically. This is an effort by Schenck to encourage people who were eligible for the draft not to register for the draft, which was a crime in the United States. And also he targeted his audience. He targeted that incitement to a criminal act specifically to the people who were eligible for the draft. This wasn't a general statement of a viewpoint. It was an incitement to violence, to criminal activity. So the question here is, does the Espionage Act violate the First Amendment guarantee of free speech? And the court says no, it doesn't. 9-0 vote, majority opinions written by Justice Holmes, as you know. Holmes uses the analogy of falsely crying fire in a crowded theater to make the distinction between speech that is protected and speech that cannot receive protection under the First Amendment. So he's defining speech as that which is upon matters of public importance and that which has a tendency to create public disorder and public harm. And he says the first kind is protected, the second isn't. Schenck engaged in the second kind, and it's okay for him to be punished. He articulates this standard. It's clear that the intended effect of the pamphlet was to influence people to commit a crime, so therefore the danger is clear, so the danger must be clear, understandable, and knowable. And it has to be present. In other words, the likelihood of it occurring is great, or it is proximally related to the danger. So, for example, if Schenck had perhaps taken his flyers and thrown them out the window of his 10th story apartment in New York City, where a few of them were picked up by a couple old ladies who were not eligible to register for the draft, it's probably he would not have been punished if the court had applied the clear and present danger doctrine. In other words, the danger was present. How likely is it that the action would be directly connected to lawless behavior? So let's say that some people did refuse to register for the draft, and their refusal to register occurred after Schenck had, in our silly little example, taken the flyers and thrown them out the window of his apartment. Can we draw a connection, a cause and effect connection, and say that him throwing the flyers caused the refusal of some individuals to register for the draft? Holmes would say no. But in the actual case, it was clearly connected, right? The danger was clear, and the cause and effect was proximal. The cause of the potential clear danger was proximal. All right, so as we said, the keys to Schenck are clear and present danger. This is a very liberal standard, and Holmes and the court uses it to reach a very conservative outcome. Now it says here the court reached similar conclusions in Frohwerk and Debs. In Debs, however, the court applied a different standard, and you should look carefully at that. Um, uh, it's a speech case, and it involved an individual advocating lawlessness, a public figure. But the court reaches the similar conclusion that his speech was not protected. So, as I said, there has to be a clear link between what is being said and the evil at hand. In other words, the cause must be proximal to the effect, and the effect has to be known, has to be clear. So, is it a good test? Well, I kind of think it is, actually. It's a good way of sorting out the type of speech that should be protected, the type that shouldn't. It is much closer to a Carolene Products footnote 4 style strict scrutiny protection than other forms of other rules in speech cases. But within a year, the court reconsiders and applies a very different test. Okay, so eventually, though, people like Holmes win out, and it may very well be that Holmes would look at the preferred freedom doctrine and say, wait a second, we really need to be looking more at the context instead of defining these areas of speech that are protected. But certainly he's closer to that than other types. So here's how things lead up through the 1930s to the preferred freedoms approach to protecting free speech. In Stromberg, the court announces a requirement that laws that ban certain kinds of speech cannot be vague. It must be clear to individuals whether they are breaking the law or not. There can't be any kind of hesitation in their mind. As a result of vague laws, people who would normally speak without feeling that they were going to be arrested might be afraid to do so, and the court calls that a chilling effect. In a case called De Jong, the court overturns another case called Whitney, and it kind of reverts to the clear and present danger doctrine. However, in Whitney, I just want to read to you a little bit from the text. It says here that the court's decision in Whitney went a step beyond previous decisions upholding the convictions of those with unpopular political views. There was no evidence that Whitney had ever taken concrete actions to bring down the government. Her conviction was based exclusively on her membership in a subversive organization. That's the distinction between Whitney and Schenck. Schenck had taken clear steps to encourage people to engage in criminal acts. Whitney was merely a member of an organization that advocated the violent overthrow of government. And she was convicted. In the case De Jong, the court overturns that logic. Now, De Jong was a member of the Communist Party, and as it says in the text, he distributed handbills calling for a meeting to protest police raids on the homes of party members. So the police raided the meeting, which was a protest about police raids, and they arrested De Jong for violating the state syndicalism act, which prohibits the organization of the Communist Party. And the court actually overturns his conviction because mere membership in an organization that might advocate unpopular views is not proximal enough to a clear threat to arrest someone for simply being a member of a party, of an organization. Okay, well, we're back to our old friend Carolene Products, footnote 4. And when the preferred freedoms doctrine in Caroline Products, which ultimately becomes a strict scrutiny doctrine, when that's applied here to free speech, once again we get the waiver of the usual presumption that laws are constitutional, and the court imposes the burden on proving constitutionality for regulating speech on government. If you look back at, say, Schenck, even Schenck, which is a very liberal standard, the individual still bears the burden. There is still a presumption of constitutionality of the laws of government. But once we get to preferred freedoms, the real shift or innovation of the court is to shift the burden from the individual to government by presuming unconstitutionality rather than constitutionality. The court says it's doing this because it has this special responsibility for defending the rights of individuals against an expansive governmental power. And that includes, of course, free speech. Also, the court believes that it has a special role in protecting the rights of individuals who may be unpopular, may be outsiders as groups, or may express unpopular ideas. So using the preferred freedoms doctrine, the court begins to strike down regulation of certain types of speech. For example, in Schneider, the court says that when a locality and a state can regulate solicitation, but it can't outright ban it because that's content discrimination, right? Can't ban solicitation altogether. In particular because it burdens free speech for everyone, but it's an effort to prevent some people from expressing unpopular viewpoints. In Thomas v. Collins, the court sort of mixes clear and present danger and preferred freedoms, but ultimately, it comes up with this important concept of prior restraint. Sometimes we refer to this as a priori restraint. Anytime government places a restraint on speech ahead of the time that the speech is actually said, actually spoken, courts tend to look unfavorably on this. In other words, if government were to pass a law that says it is illegal to speak communist talk, and if you do, you're going to be punished, that would be an a priori notification that you better not speak or you're going to be punished. And the court would strike that down. On the other hand, under the preferred freedoms doctrine, if you remember, government must demonstrate a compelling interest in placing an a priori restraint on speech. So government restrictions, a priori restrictions on, say, fighting words have been upheld by the court. A state can certainly say, if you engage in fighting words, words that have a tendency to create lawlessness and incite violence, we're going to punish you. Those types of a priori restraints are acceptable. Okay, after the demise of the clear and present danger doctrine, before we ultimately get to a straight up preferred freedoms approach to speech, the court used several other tests. In Dennis versus United States, the court applied something called the clear and probable danger test. Now, I want to clarify something. I use the word probable when referring to the clear and present danger test. There's a distinction between clear and present danger and clear and probable danger. What does it mean for an evil to be present? It means that it's proximally located. It is the proximal cause of the evil. Under clear and probable danger standard, all the court has to do is to assess the gravity of the evil, right? The importance of it, how serious a threat is this to public order, and then discount that by the improbability of it ever happening. If the gravity of the evil is so great, even when discounted by the improbability of it happening, that justifies an invasion of the right or a regulation of the free speech right. So Yeah, you might want to go back and look at the dissents in Dennis. What did those dissents set up? There's some real concern after Dennis that there is no way to protect the speech of communists, that communists simply can't get any protection whatsoever um, as a result of their speaking, and so they would be afraid to speak at all. So, reading from the text here now, Dennis was convicted under the Espionage Act, also called the Smith Act. And this is the act that prohibited anyone from knowingly or willfully advocating or teaching the overthrow of any government of the United States by force, from organizing any society to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of the United States by force, or becoming a member of such a society. So Dennis was convicted under this act, and and then the court upheld his conviction. All right. This result, the punishment of Dennis, his imprisonment for violating the Espionage Act, fueled what's called McCarthyism, which was a effort to seek out and root out communism wherever you might find it. And McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, was a senator who led a campaign to root out communism in Hollywood. And he ended up finding communists under every rock, and it ultimately led to his undoing. He required people to name names, testifying before Congress, and it basically turned into a witch hunt, and he ultimately it led to his own demise. In the Warren Court era, however, we see an expansion of freedoms, expansion of protection of the freedom of speech. For example, in Pennsylvania versus Nelson, it says the federal government has sole control over subversive activities. Yates versus United States, the court modifies the Dennis standards and differentiates between advocacy and abstract doctrine. Differentiates between advocating lawlessness and just speaking about, in abstract terms, about a political doctrine and what might happen if that doctrine was accepted or acted on. And once again, the court does not go back fully to preferred freedoms, and it ends the McCarthy era with a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. Let's talk about this case a little bit. So, in this case, the court makes a distinction, and this is the really important point to remember. It makes this distinction between advocacy of an idea and incitement to violence. So these are two different matters here. What if I said, hey, let's think about what it would mean to take over the campus and really impose upon the campus a vision of fairness and justice that we would all like. Fairness in terms of pay for support staff and really making a difference in the lives of people who work for the university. And I think this is going to require us, at the beginning anyway, to take over a couple buildings, including the administration building. Now that's a little different than saying, folks, we're going to go burn down the administration building. I have the buckets full of gasoline here, some empty wine bottles, and some rags. We're going to make some Molotov cocktails, and then we're going to march over and burn down the administration building. One is advocacy of an idea, however unpopular it might be, and the other is an incitement to actual violence. So that's not fully preferred freedoms, however. The court, even while making the distinction between advocacy and incitement, the court outlines a number of categories of speech that government may restrict, even in some cases placing a priori restraints on that speech. And we talked about one, fighting words. But the text does a really good job at the end of lining out areas that government may regulate and restrictions on government regulation. Now, Brandenburg was an interesting case. Brandenburg was the grand wizard, grand poobah, whatever, of the Ohio Ku Klux Klan. And this organization had been infiltrated by the FBI. The FBI, members of the FBI and informants were present at a rally at which Brandenburg spoke, and he said, and this is basically a quote, "The Jew and the black man have conspired together to deprive the white man of his rightful place at the head of Western civilization." And then he said, "If things don't change, there might have to be some revengeance taken." Sort of invented a new word there. Well, he was arrested for inciting violence, and the court looked at that speech and said, no, that was advocacy of an idea. Another speech, another case involved an individual who was, when he was a member of the Black Panthers, and he was asked about what he would do if his draft number came up and he was drafted into the military. And he said, if they draft me into the Army and give me a gun, the first person I'm going to shoot is LBJ, who was then President of the United States. He was arrested for inciting violence, threatening the life of the president, and the court overturned that conviction and said he was speaking in hyperbole, and there was no evidence whatsoever that he actually intended to carry out that plan. So advocacy of an idea, despite the fact that we don't really have preferred freedoms in total for speech, advocacy of an idea, however unpopular, is still supposed to be protected. It oftentimes is. We do, however, see people being punished for expressing a belief. The professor at the University of Colorado who wrote in support of what had been done on 9/11, destroying the World Trade Center. He lost his job because they went through everything he'd written with a fine-tooth comb, and ended up firing him from the university. It seemed to me that that was retaliation for expressing an unpopular idea. So here is an overview of the free speech standards, and this is an important slide. First, we have the clear and present danger doctrine the court announced in Schenck. Then we have something called bad tendency. This is an important category or rule to understand. The court applied bad tendency almost immediately after applying clear and present danger. Bad tendency simply means that certain words are so bad, they have such a bad tendency to create violence, that government can ban them outright by placing an a priori restraint on speech. So I give the example to distinguish between these two of Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway. So now in Schenck, Justice Holmes used the analogy of falsely crying fire in a crowded theater, and that's context driven, right? Saying fire is not banned, but saying fire when there is no fire in a crowded theater, a theater full of people, would tend to create mass panic, and you could be punished for it. Well, under bad tendency, they would say something like this: the word fire has a tendency to create public harm, so we're going to ban it outright. Well, how about Tom Hanks on his little island in Castaway, banging on his chest saying, I have made fire? Under the bad tendency doctrine, he'd be punished for saying fire. They wouldn't look at the context in which that word was stated at all. As we said, that should, well, clear and present danger in De Jong, it makes a comeback. Preferred freedoms informs a lot of the court's decisions. Thomas v. Collins sort of is a mixture of the two. Then we get to clear and probable danger, in particular in a case called Dennis. And finally, Brandenburg makes the distinction between advocacy and incitement, and defines incitement as, and I didn't mention this earlier, but it's important to know, the court defines incitement in Brandenburg as imminent lawless action. Now think about that. Lawless action, of course, is crime, but the crime has to be imminent. Saying if they don't change things with regard to Jews and blacks, there's going to be some revengeance taken. That is not imminent. There's no plan. There's nothing. There's no overt action or even covert action taken. Okay, thank you very much for your attention to this introduction to free speech doctrine.